ladies and gentlemen, the books is in. The books are in. Yep. They in. They're here. Black African Power. ETM Hotel, Rennie Sean. Welcome in peace. My name is Sean. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning into the Masa Warrior Clan YouTube show. Please like the show, share the show, tell a friend, We're actually live. We're going to get into the evolution of culture. So again, share the stream, like the show, share the show. Tell everybody we're live, man. Jama Mboka. To everybody out there, man, Lafayette, to all my West African compadres in the chat. Peace, Zane, peace, ATL, Teddy, Juju was good from West Africa, was good. Boogie for sure was good. Keenan was good. What's going on, man? Like the show, share the show, share the show, share the show. We're gonna get into a nice little build today, man, and we're going to go over a couple of little things. Of course, I'll hit you with a couple of sources in the actual description of this particular video. And I got something in the works for you. So I want to go ahead and I want to play the actual copyright edition while we're sharing the show. And we're waiting on some of our brothers and sisters to get in the chat. And then we're going to get all the way right with it. Like all the way right with it. So hopefully everybody's having a good day today, man. You've been able to, do whatever it is that you normally would do on your Saturday or Saturday evenings. If you're into certain things or different perspectives or whatnot, then I understand that, and that's cool. You be you and do what you got to do, no matter what, how people look at it. But come on, man, share the show, like the show, share the show. We're about to go all the way in. This is about culture. This is about the evolution of culture. We finna talk that talk today. This evening, tonight. And while we doing it, I'm going to go ahead and get it cranked up and let y'all know where you at and whose channel this is. And then we're going to get right into our program.
You looking at a young black king. Astro project, blast of attack, pass your neck with the shit to leave a rapper and Rex from the back of a black Acura. Bullet ricocheted and swayed and it passed through your pecs. The assassin wet. All y'all know y'all don't have to go. Sawed off shoddy, make you potty, probably call the law. Me no gangster, I'm no tough, got me child of the most high. I get on the mic and you go, bye bye. Devil don't test me, I throw shrapnel where your chest be. Shooting our family down in the streets. Fuck the police, they ain't marching for me. Pull up, not that Rari, I ain't bad yet. I pull up out that 85% of mass at. I put this on God, bad black is so hard. Bitch, I'm going back to Harlem in my West African garb.
Yeah, so Again, man, as you're coming in, like the show, share the show, tell a friend, tell a friend. We're getting a late night lesson in this evening. And we're gonna build, man. We're gonna build all uh the way it's supposed to be done. We're gonna show you how to actually do this thing the correct way. Demonstration beats conversation. That's what rules the nation. All right. They don't call me any Heret California for nothing. He who brings back the lost shall lead. We're gonna keep it African over here. You know what I mean? That's what we're about. As descendants of Africans, as African Americans, as diasporan Africans. That's how we rock over here. We all about African and African American and African diasporan culture over here, traditions over here, history over here, science when it involves science over here, right? We about all that. Kimoyo over here. We about all that over here. So we just know how to do things a little bit better the way they're supposed to be done for people to actually learn and be able to evolve, right? Not just involve yourself in the conversation, but evolve, learn something, advance the actual topic of conversation, add something to it. Science is about knowledge. Science is about knowing, and science is also about using tools. By utilizing those tools and knowing, you can advance scholarship. So Kofi's gonna have a beautiful show tomorrow. He's gonna break down a couple of things. I hope everybody tune in to the Kofi Pasi research team, or he may do it on the Masi. I don't know which channel is gonna be on, but make sure you do your due diligence to make sure that you subscribe to both channels and you click the notification bell and you like our streams and all of that, because he's going to go in, and when he goes in, make sure that you're a part of the conversation. But for now, let's get this culture. All right, so we have a cultural evolution theory, how culture evolves and why it matters. Article. It's 8 pages. Of course, you know the majority of the pages are sources. Now, cultural evolutionary theory. This is what we're going to take a look at today, and we're going to get into what we need to get into. All right, so fix or adjust your cell phone screens. If you're on your cell phone, adjust the quality, go to the 3 dots, click the 3 dots on your phone or in your settings or whatever their YouTube settings right there. Go in advanced, and then change the quality of your video from 140 to 720. It should come through clear. Make sure you're joining the conversation and that you're being a part of it so that we can get this culture. I just told you what to do. You have to fix your settings. If you can't see this, you have to fix your settings on your cell phone. So if you have a Droid, you just simply click the 3 dots on the YouTube. If you have an iPhone, I believe it's still hit the 3 dots and make the adjustment so that it is clear on your end, and get through it. I know if I just tap my screen, the video comes up, and then it says, I hit the 3 dots, and then it says quality. So I would go to quality, and then it says auto, high picture quality, data saver, and advanced. I would go to advanced, and then I will select a specific resolution in advanced. And when I select advanced, then I go to 720, hit it, and then my picture is clear. Okay. Well, if you did that, then you should be good to go. Oh, now it's clear now. Okay. Yeah, I'm on your head. All right. So let's move forward. You need to look at YouTube from your TV with your glasses on. Straight up. All right. So I can't blow it up any further than I have right now. If I do it any further than any more than this, it's gonna mess it up. So cultural evolutionary theory, how culture evolves and why it matters. Human cultural traits, behaviors, ideas, and technologies that can be learned from other individuals can exhibit complex patterns of transmission and evolution. And researchers have developed theoretical models, both verbal and mathematical, to facilitate our understanding of these patterns. Many of the first quantitative models of cultural evolution were modified from existing concepts in theoretical population genetics because cultural evolution has many parallels with as well as clear differences from genetic evolution. Furthermore, cultural and genetic evolution can interact with one another and influence both transmission and selection. This interaction requires theoretical treatments of gene culture, coevolution, and dual inheritance in addition to purely cultural evolution. In addition to cultural evolutionary theory is a natural component of studies in demography, human ecology, and many other disciplines. Here we review the core concepts in cultural evolutionary theory as they pertain to the extension of biology through culture, focusing on cultural evolutionary applications in population genetics, ecology, and demography. For each of these disciplines, we review the theoretical literature and highlight relevant empirical studies. We also discuss the social implications of the study of cultural evolution and the interactions of humans with one another and with their environment. Human culture encompasses ideas, behaviors, and artifacts that can be learned and transmitted between individuals and can change over time. This process of transmission and change is reminiscent of Darwin's principle of descent with modifications through natural selection, and Darwin himself drew this explicit link in the case of languages. The formation of different languages and of distinct species, and the proofs that both have been developed through a gradual process, are curiously parallel. Theory unpins most scientific endeavors, and in the 1970s, researchers began to lay the groundwork for cultural evolutionary theory, building on the neo Darwinism synthesis of genetics and evolution by using verbal, diagrammatic, and mathematical models. These models are, by necessity, approximations of reality, but because they require researchers to specify their assumptions and extract the most important features from complex processes, they have proven exceedingly useful in advancing the study of cultural evolution. Here we review the field of cultural evolutionary theory as it pertains to the extension of biology through culture. We focus on human culture because the bulk of cultural evolutionary models are human centric, and certain processes, such as cumulative culture, seem to be unique to humans. However, numerous non human species also exhibit cultural transmission, and we consider the areas of overlap between models of human and animal culture in discussions. The study of cultural evolution is important beyond its academic value. Cultural evolution is a fundamentally interdisciplinary field, bridging gaps between academic disciplines and facilitating connections between uh, disparate approaches. Now, for example, the advent of technologies for revealing genomic variations has led to a plethora of studies that measure association between DNA variants and traits that have major cultural components, such as years of schooling, marrying, choicing, IQ test results, and poverty. Perhaps because of the perceived greater precision of the genomic data, these cultural transmitted components have been relegated to the deep background, creating a misleading public portrayal of the traits as being predetermined by genetics. Models of the dynamics of interaction among culture, demographic, and genetics, which uncover the complexities in the determination of these behavior and traits, are crucial to remedy these potential dangerous misinterpretations. See, here we explore the ways in which cultural evolutionary theory and its application enhance our understanding of human history and human biology, focusing on the links between cultural evolutionary theory and population genetics, human behavior, ecology, and demography. Throughout We give examples of efforts to apply theory to data, linking models of cultural evolution to empirical studies of genetics, language, archaeology, and anthropology. For example, studies of cultural factors, including language and customs, help biologists interpret data of genetic evolution that might be misinterpreted if the cultural context were not taken into account. I want to repeat this line for all the people out there that are not listening. I'm running this back for you. For example, studies of cultural factors, including language and customs, help biologists interpret patterns of genetic evolution that might be misinterpreted if the cultural context were not taken into account. You have heard many of us make arguments before when we're dealing with history, and especially when we're talking about Egypt in the field of their Rani Kemet, or the Egyptian spoken language, and we look at the primary sources, and people speculate and assume things about the culture and all these arguments that persist or happen twice a year. Well, we can let the ancestors speak, because scientifically you can't use some things to argue against others. So, for example, studies of cultural factors, including language and customs, help biologists. Why would a biologist need to help in understanding the studies of cultural factors that include language and customs? Why would language and customs be important for a biologist? Because it helps them interpret patterns of genetic evolution that might be misinterpreted, misrepresented, not appreciated if the cultural context was not taken into an account. So a biologist can go in Africa and get amongst the people that are in a particular area in Africa and sit there and do all the studying that they want to do. But the one thing that they can't get is the cultural context, because they may not be able to speak the language and understand the customs of the people they're studying. And they may push on them their worldview in order for them to find a translation of what it would mean in their culture, whoever the biologist is that is foreign to the land. So here we understand now the importance of cultural context and the validity of it to biologists, and how important the languages and the customs are as well. But many people will have you to believe, right, that linguistics, which some of them don't understand, is really that not that important. Or I don't get what you're saying, and I don't understand this and all. But now you know. Human culture encompasses ideas, behaviors, and artifacts. You heard me say that. So I don't want to go back to that point again, but it does. All right. So let's move forward. Many of the first models of cultural evolution drew explicit parallels between culture and genes by modifying concepts from theoretical population genetics and applying them to culture. Cultural patterns of transmission, innovation, random fluctuations, and selections of conceptual and analogous to genetic processes of transmission, mutations, drift, and selection, and many of mathematical techniques used to study genetics can be useful in the study of culture. However, these mathematical approaches had to be modified to account for the differences between genetic and cultural transmission. For example, We do not expect cultural transmission to follow the rules of genetic transmission strictly. Indeed, cultural traits are likely to deviate from all three laws of Mendelian inheritance, like segregation, independent assortment, and dominance. The simple observation that cultural traits need not conform to Mendelian's inheritance is sufficient to produce complex evolutionary dynamics. If children are likely to reject a cultural trait that both of their parents possess, the frequency of that trait in the population may oscillate between generations. In addition, if two biological parents have different forms of cultural trait, their children is not necessarily equally likely to acquire the mother or the father's form of that trait. Further, a child can acquire cultural traits not only from its parents, vertical transmission, but also from non parental adults, oblique, and peers, horizontal. Thus, the frequency of a cultural trait in the population is relevant beyond just the probability that individuals' parents had that trait. In most cases, the more common a cultural trait is in a population, the more likely it is for an individual to have the opportunity to acquire it through social learning. However, the size of the population may also influence the continuing transmission and thus survival of the cultural trait. The relative importance of a population size and its environmental context for the reaction and perhaps expansion of the cultural repertoire constitutes an ongoing debate. The roles of transmission and innovation in cultural evolution. Thus far, we have made the analogy between alleles of a gene and the forms of a cultural trait, implying that the cultural trait question can be represented in a binary and discrete manner. Although this approximation is appropriate from some cultural transmitted traits, such as knowing or not knowing how to use a certain tool, or smoking or not smoking, some cultural traits are more naturally regarded as continuous or quantitative traits. For example, cultural norms and preferences, such as a degree of risk tolerance, have been modeled as continuous traits. And knowledge of a tool or technique has usually been represented in terms of a quantitative skill level. Like genes, cultural traits can be more or less adaptive depending on the environment and spread accordingly. An interesting question is the following. If a certain behavior may be either innate, genetically determined, or culturally acquired and thus potentially responsive to the environment, which environmental patterns would favor the genetic transmission? Models predict that spaciously varying environments will favor cultural transmission, whereas only high stable environments will favor the genetic determination of the behavior. Cavalli, Sforza, and Feldman note an important reason that genes, cultural traits, and environment should be considered together. Given the existence of an individual plasticity in response to the environment, correlations between biological relatives are unexpected, even if there is no genetic variation whatsoever. Unlike in genetics, where mutations are the source of new traits, cultural innovation can occur via multiple processes and at multiple scales. Most of the models described above include the cultural transmission of existing traits without providing a mechanism for novel traits to be introduced to the population. In many models of social learning, new information enters a population via trial and error, learning, or individual interaction with the environment, and this information can then be culturally transmitted. New cultural traits can also originate when existing traits are combined in novel ways, which can lead to exponential rates of cultural accumulation. Recent models represent innovation as a result of multiple interaction processes, and cultural traits can accumulate and punctuate bursts when these processes of innovations are independent. A truly groundbreaking innovation can pave the way for many related innovations and novel combinations. Such dynamics may explain some of the punctuated bursts that are observed in the archaeological record of stone tools, like the dramatic increases in complexity near the transition from the middle to the upper Paleolithic, and from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, and may provide an account of the dynamics of technological development in historical times. So, in many models of cultural evolution, the frequency of one or more cultural traits is tracked over time, and the equilibrium properties are sought. However, recent research highlights the dynamics of cultural accumulation that occur in a transient example if innovation process is independent as described above. The cultural repertoire can fluctuate dramatically before approaching an equilibrium because the loss of gain of a groundbreaking innovation can lead to the loss of gain of its relative innovations as well. In addition, these models demonstrate how innovation process can change the parameters and therefore the dynamics of cultural evolution, possibly altering the cultural equilibrium if there is one. For example, a game-changing innovation such as the transition from foraging to agriculture could allow a population to feed many more people. Thus, a cultural innovation can alter the size of the population, which is generally set as a fixed parameter in cultural evolutionary models. Such non equilibrium dynamics arise, for example, in a recent comparison between modeling predictions and the archaeological record that showed that the frequencies of Neolithic pottery features over time are not consistent with a cultural system at equilibrium. Linking genetic and cultural evolution, as mentioned above, the order treatments of cultural transmission and evolution can usefully draw a concept from theoretical population of genetics, extending them to accommodate cultural processes. However, a genetic evolutionary process can also interact with one another with the environment, and elucidating the relative contributions of genes, culture, and environment to a phenotype can be very difficult. I'm going to say that again. Elucidating the relative contributions of genes, culture, and environment to a phenotype can be very difficult. So, for all the people that are using a phenotype to say who's either Egyptian or not, you are making a very difficult argument. Very difficult. You saying that black people wasn't up there and this, that, and the third. You're making a very difficult argument and you don't even understand what you're talking about. I'm bringing this thing full circle. When cultural and genetic evolution interact, the dynamics of both genetic and cultural traits are likely to be very different from those characteristics of only one mode of transmission. Further, cultural traits can alter the selection pressures on genetic traits and vice versa. For example, genetic traits that are adaptive in one cultural background might not be adaptive in another. The classic example of these interactions between cultural and genetic evolution is lactose persistence in adulthood. For much of human history, there was little reason to digest milk. Weaning and adults did not typically produce the enzyme that digests lactose. However, with the cultural practice of cattle domestication and dairying, a genetic mutation that enabled the production of the lactose enzyme in adulthood was strongly favored by selection. Theoretical analysis show that gene culture coevolution can be dynamically complex and surprisingly unpredictable. For example, a well-known finding in the population genetics is that a fitness advantage of the heterozygote genotypes maintain genetic variations in a population. However, it is not sufficient to maintain genetic variation for heterozygote offspring to be superior to homozygotes in the ability to acquire an advantages cultural trait that is advantageous cultural trait that is transmitted culturally by a parent. In fact, the fitness advantage to the cultural transmitted trait has to be sufficiently large that it overcomes imperfection in vertical cultural transmission from parents to child. In a similar vein, Akoi modeled the evolution of genetic trait that increased the efficiency of teaching, defined as the vertical transmission of cultural trait. Genetic variations at this teaching locus could not be maintained by asexual haploid genetics and uniparental cultural transmission, but sexual haploid genetics and biparental cultural transmission could preserve both polymorphism of the teaching locus and the polymorphism of the cultural trait. These examples illustrate the theoretical complexity that emerges when standard population genetic theory is extended to include the interactions between genetic and cultural traits. The result is a highly nonlinear theory with complications not seen in purely biological theory. Hey man, like the show, share the show, tell a friend, we live, man. The people in the building. The theoretical literature on gene-culture interactions has become increasingly relevant in the genomic era. Genome-wide association studies, the GWAS, has shown many genomic associations with a wide array of complex phenotypes and have allowed detections of signals of genetic adaptation. However, GWAS studies of behavioral phenotypes such as IQ, educational, entertainment, and the life history should be interpreted with care. As the authors of one such study state, studies of genetic analysis of behavioral phenotypes have been prone to misinterpretation, such as characterizing identified associated variants as genes for education. Such characterization is not correct for many reasons. Educational attainment is primarily determined by environmental factors. Statistical relationships between genetic variants and behaviors need not be casual because assortative mating, spatial autocorrelation, and a shared environment can influence such relationships. Twin studies of tobacco smoking point to interacting roles of genetics, environment, and assortative mating in the initiation of continuous of smoking. In a large-scale study of human health, environmental and cultural factors should be also be considered because these could conflate the effects of genetics and ancestry with those of poverty, stress, racism, or socioeconomic status. For example, data from a large-scale health and retirement study show an association between African ancestry and hypertension. The prevalence of hypertension was 8% points higher in respondents with the highest quartile of African ancestry compared with those with the lowest quartile. However, controlling for a subset of factors related to socioeconomic status, like childhood, disadvantaged education, income, and wealth, explained 38% of this disparity reduces it to a 5% point difference. So many theoretical population genetic studies make the assumption that mating is random within a population. However, in real human populations, the assumption is often violated as individuals tend to prefer mates with similar phenotypes, such as eye color, height, IQ, education level, and smoking status. Cultural evolutionary theory has led to significant advances in our understanding of the effects of non-random mating, revealing that the transmission and dynamics of cultural traits can be sensitive to both phenotypic and environmental assorting. Assortative mating, leading to an increased correlation between mates for genetic or cultural traits, can increase both genotypic and phenotypic variance in a population. In addition, assortative mating and other forms of homophily acting on one cultural trait can influence the evolutionary dynamics of other cultural traits, facilitating the spread of rare cultural or genetic variants. More generally, assorting can affect not just mate choice, but many types of cultural interactions termed assortative meeting. Empirical work supports this theoretical finding. For example, beneficial health behavior spread more readily through a social network when individual social connects were more similar to themselves. Cultural mediated assortment can also lead to biological differences. Partners that are more similar tend to have more offspring, thus increasing fitness and assortative mating within highly homophilic groups affects the average length of homozygous DNA segments, leading to the appearance of higher levels of inbreeding than might actually exist. Humans can also assort by language. However, studies of interactions between language and genetic population structures show that the resulting dynamics can differ by population. For example, in some geographic regions, language boundaries do not seem to act as barriers to gene flow, whereas in other places, assorting with respect to language seems to have a large effect. And genetic similarity is more closely associated with language than with geographic distance. Assortative mating has had a measurable effect on human genomic architecture, and genetic and phenotypic correlations between partners are substantial. In addition to choosing their mates, non randomly individuals can also choose their cultural role models. These cultural transmission biases affect the relationship between a trait's frequency in a population and is likely of transmission. For example, conformity bias is an exaggerated preference for the cultural variant practiced by the majority of the population, which can lead to an increasingly large majority over time. Alternatively, individuals might preferably seek out novel cultural traits termed rarity bias of novelty bias. These frequency dependent biases can lead to patterns of cultural diffusion in which the prevalence of cultural trait can change dramatically over short timescales, producing logistic growth, the S shaped curves of trait frequencies over time. Examples of cultural traits that are likely to exhibit frequency dependent transmissions are fashion trends, career choices, baby names. Conformist transmission is likely to dominate when the environment is relatively stable and common cultural traits are well adapted to that environment. Other types of transmission biases reflect not how common a trait in the population, but the characteristics of people who have the trait. In the case of prestige bias, individuals attempt to acquire cultural traits that are perceived to be high quality by selectively learning from those individuals with high social rank. For example, in an experimental test, children were much more likely to choose an adult cultural role model if they had observed bystanders attending to the potential model rather than ignoring him or her. Thus, even at the very early age, humans can assess such characteristics as prestige or social standing. Individuals can also use observation of success associated with cultural trait, such a fruitful hunt with a certain tool to help preference for cultural role models that are demonstrably successful. This bias has been demonstrated experimentally. For example, when individuals participate in simulated hunting with virtual arrowheads and then modify their arrowheads either by trial and error or imitation, copying successful individuals gave significantly better results than trial and error. So we're going to get into a little bit more, and then I'm gonna transition into some good information. But what I'm doing is laying down a foundation of how culture evolves and why it matters. Because there's this stigma or there's a mindset, right, to ignore culture, to demonize one's culture and focus on just human behavior. But human behavior or their worldview isn't the same. If we're growing up on different parts of this planet and we're seeing the sun rise and set and the moon rise and sets, if we're seeing that at different times and we're seeing stars, we're seeing the sky differently, or we begin to practice certain individual behaviors differently than other people that are observing the world and are identifying themselves a particular way, and they're evolving under that same sunrise and sunset, but just have different elements of understanding going on. Then when that culture evolves, the significance of it is just that much more important. So why study human behavior and ignore the cultural context? What what anthropologist would go out of their way to do that? See, that's a scientific field of study. So there's a methodology for that. So I'm here to restore culture into every conversation you might ever have. Look at the pandemic. The pandemic has affected some people's culture, and in other parts of the world, the pandemic has taken on COVID-19 is God's now in some people's culture. A disease that will take you out of here has become a deity in certain cultures around the world. So when we talk about the importance of this, right? Since we're talking about humans, you have to study culture. You can't half-ass it. And you can't generalize culture. You can't generalize humanity because everybody is not the same. Everybody don't see things the same. Yeah, your human biology or your genetics, genetically speaking, we might all, inside have similarities, but phenotypically we may have several differences there. But when it comes down to shaving things, it is the models of culture and human ecology that matter. For thousands of generations, humans have been carving their existence in the world with cultural tools that have become integral to their livelihoods, thereby shaping their environment at all scales, both intentionally and unintentionally. Attempting to answer the question of what are the extensions of human biology through culture leads to a striking conclusion. There are a few aspects of human biology that have not been shaped by our culture. Human culture has also affected biology, even the survival of non human species. In this section, we review a number of cases for which incorporating culture into models of eco-evolutionary dynamics has proven valuable for the interpretation, prediction, and in some cases, direction of human ecology and human impact on the ecosystem. Niche construction is a process in which organisms modify their environment in a way that alters the selective pressures that these organisms experience, thus affecting evolution. A special case of niche construction is cultural niche construction, the alteration of the environment through cultural practices which may themselves evolve. Cultural niche construction involves complex dynamics in which selective pressures act on the culture itself, interacting with genetic evolution and the environment to influence the spread of both genetic and cultural traits. Because cultural change has the potential to occur faster than genetic adaptation, dynamics of the niche construction that are driven by cultural traits play a prominent role in human evolution. Yet, only the recent decades has cultural evolution begun to be explicitly incorporated into human evolutionary ecology. Studies that pioneered this approach showed how it can provide insight into the dynamics of the demographic transition in post-industrialized societies. For example, the reduction of birth rate during the demographic transition is often characterized as a paradox because, from a Darwinian fitness perspective, individuals should prefer to have more offspring, not fewer. However, if a cultural norm favoring small family size spreads, the fertility rate can drop as well, resulting in culturally induced demographic transition, which is a case where natural selection and cultural transmission seem to be in opposition. The niche construction approach has been productive in many other studies, such as those that describe culturally driven change at the ecosystem level. For example, the extension of megafauna after the arrival of humans, the change of broad scale landscapes as a result of cultivation in early and recent times, and the traditional use of fire as a means of manipulating the environmental dynamics in a way that beneficial for humans. Niche construction is also important in understanding the evolutionary dynamics driven by changes in the immediate environment that human experience, such as via construction and shelter productions of clothing that enable the expansion of humans into otherwise uninhabitable regions, and the use of fire for food handling, which allow dramatic changes in substance and may even have led to significant change to the anatomy of the human jaw. A key aspect of human evolution is the change over time in human substance strategies. Several models consider the interaction of hunter-gatherers with the population of organisms that they consume and how these interact over time. They propose the predation pressure can decrease at prey species population and exert selective pressures in favor of early reproduction at a smaller body size, potentially leaving a telltale pattern in the archaeological record. The results may be uh, the prey species extinction, which forces humans to shift their diet in response. Such models as the diet breath model, the broad spectrum revolution, and nutritional ecology capture some of these processes, and although they differ in many important dimensions, such as in the role they assign to plants in the diet, they share the realization that cultural dynamics, genetic evolution, and ecological processes must be considered jointly to understand human evolution. Studies in the tradition have also proposed how gradually changing cultural practices may have created the conditions that culminated the Neolithic Revolution, with the domestication of multiple plant and animal species and the subsequent changes in almost every aspect of human existence. An interesting niche construction perspective of these topics is proposed by Smith and Zitter. Human behavioral ecology applies approaches that were developed with a focus on non-human species to the interpretation of human behavior. One of these approaches is based on the optimality in behavior and studies frequently devise models that capture human behavioral constraints and alternatives, as well as their associated payoffs, which are then considered jointly in predicting behavior of explaining the evolutionary underpinning of observed behaviors, often under the assumption that humans behave in a way that maximizes their fitness. A broad range of empirical, theoretical studies of cultural determined behaviors bear directly on human fitness, past and present. Human ecological traits such as life history profiles, substance strategies, mating preferences, economic decisions making, social structures have been analyzed to predict individual behavior and to support potential intervention that might alter human behaviors at a social level. Interestingly, few humans in the human ecology consider the dynamics of cultural evolution on which the studied behaviors depend. Thus, for example, it is frequently assumed that alternative possible behaviors are available to the human group of interest when they might not be, such as different substance strategies. Similarly, with some notable exceptions, Human behavioral ecology models often do not consider ecological and evolutionary dynamics that may depend on the studied behavior and that play out of the intermediate and long timescales. For example, how would prey populations evolve over long periods of time in response to a certain human uh, foraging strategy, and how would that feedback onto human strategy choice? We suggest that these aspects are promising avenues for future exploration. One of the hotly debated topics in human prehistory is the replacement of the Neanderthals by modern humans 40,000 years ago. A recent study proposed an eco-cultural model that incorporated cultural differences between two competing species into loca and Volterra competition dynamics. Dynamics, and showed that a difference in culture between moderns and Neanderthal could have driven the latter's extinction. This model explicitly includes cultural evolutionary dynamics and shows that a difference in the population size between the moderns in Africa and Neanderthals in Eurasia could have led to a difference in the cultural complexity between the two populations, allowing the small groups of moderns that migrated out of Africa to gradually outcompete the larger population of Neanderthals that they encountered. This pattern, with one group replacing another as a result of culturally derived advantage, is likely to have taken place repeatedly throughout human history. Thus, for example, genetic evidence largely supports a scenario in which the Neolithic evolution spread throughout the world, not by diffusion or farming practices among groups, but by replacement of hunter-gatherers groups by farmers. A second revolution occurred 6,000 to 4,000 years ago when the early Neolithic farmers were overwhelmed by Yamanya invaders from the Russian steppe who had a cultural advantage of transportation by horse. Such dynamics in which cultural adaptation to temporal variable conditions may play an important role are also pervasive. More recently, for example, competition between pastoralists and agriculturalists and replacement of one by the other are documented from biblical times to present. Models are also important in analyzing humans' cultural and genetic coevolution with pathogens, the realm in which many of our species' harshest evolutionary changes have occurred. Some of the clearest signals of natural selection in the human genome are found near genes that are directly related to coping with diseases such as malaria, Kuru, and others. And the understanding of the evolutionary dynamics is greatly enhanced when we are able to couple such genetic evidence and cultural dynamics that influence them. Durham, for example, argues that yam farming practices in West Africa significantly increased standing water, thus increasing breeding sites for malaria carrying mosquitoes, which led to high exposure to malaria, exerted selective pressure in favor of genetic variants that increase resistance to malaria. In the New Guinea highlands, cannibalism practices that were widespread until the 1940s drove the Kuru epidemic among the people of this region. A model of cultural pathogen interactions demonstrated that different behavioral regimes should shape dynamics of pathogenic bacteria, leading to non-intuitive outcomes. For example, antibiotic strands will spread throughout the population in the presence of ambiguous antibiotic use, whereas the WT bacteria have a fitness advantage if antibiotics are not used. However, if people modify their behavior by decreasing use of antibiotics when they become less effective, both WT and resistant pathogens can coexist. A fast growing body of research focuses on the host associated microbiome. The communities of organisms are mostly bacteria that live on in eukaryotes. The dynamics of the microbiome can interact with those of its host, including genetic variations, cultural practices, environmental context, further complicating the study of evolutionary process. Thus, for example, the interaction between dairy farming and the selection of the lactase persistent gene has become the poster child of the gene culture coevolution. However, lactose using bacteria in humans' digestive tracts are very likely to have played a prominent role in the emergence of dairy farming. Moreover, these bacteria continue to affect individuals who do not carry a genetic mutation that allows them to efficiently digest dairy in adulthood. Understanding how cultural practices influence human microbe interactions may provide us not only with insight with the Neolithic farming revolution or early cattle domestication and related human evolution since then, but also with necessary tools to make informed nutritional choices, such as those related to dairy utilization in our present lives. Thus, worldwide dietary recommendations stand to benefit significantly from an improved understanding of microbe human interactions. The growth and the age and structure of human populations are both affected by norms and beliefs of their members. A predominantly agricultural lifestyle produced higher population growth than the hunting gathering lifestyle it replaced. This increased growth was most likely due to the spread of complex of cultural traits, whose adoption may have been created conditions that favored the accumulation of subsequent culturally transmitted behaviors. Beginning in the late 19th century, parts of Europe, Asia, United States, Australia, and New Zealand began to undergo a second demographic transition, which involved a change from a high birth rate, high mortality regime to a low birth rate, low mortality regime. These changes were due to the spread of fertility reducing and survival increasing behaviors that became a part of a developed country's cultures. Standard quantitative models of demographic change do not include within population variations and behaviors that affect uh, uh, futiny or mortality projections, usually fixed values for birth and death rates. However, religious preferences, marriage customs, dietary choices, population subdivisions, and mortality profiles may affect futiny, but are usually, I might be saying it wrong, but are usually not part of the demographic models. Further aspects of cultural transmission, such as prestige bias and the choice of non parental cultural role models, can facilitate the spread of fertility reduces behavior. Thus, cultural evolutionary approaches should be integrated into demographic, especially the process that have led to fertility decline. Many models for life history analysis of humans divided the lifespan into an ordered series of age classes. These models first define the fertility rates of each age class and the survival rates from one age class to the next. Then they iterate the number in each age class produced by the parameters to determine the dynamics of the population, including whether the number in each age class approaches a stable equilibrium term, the stationary age distribution, or whether the population will grow or go extinct at what rate. Karotna 2 proposed a democultural framework for such an aged structured population in which individuals carry one variant of dichotomous trait, say H or lowercase h, where capital H represents the presence of a socially learned behavior, for example, fertility control, and the lowercase h is in the absence. An individual with the type capital H might also be more likely to survive into the next age class. This integration of demography and cultural yields complex dynamics. For example, the capital H trait can persist in the populations even if it lowers fertility, as long as the cultural transmission of capital H is reliable through, or if capital H also sufficiently increases the chances of its survival. Additional learning steps can also be added to age structure models such that vertical and horizontal transmission can occur at different rates for different age classes. In this case, horizontal learning, if you're just joining us, horizontal learning is peer to peer, people you grew up with, your friends. Vertical is your parents, grandparents. All right, so in the case of horizontal learning, accelerated the trait spread and led to faster population growth than vertical transmission alone. An important outgrowth of democultural modeling has been its application to the sex ratio problem. In many places, the sex ratio at birth is strongly biased in favor of males, and in China and parts of India, has resulted in up to 120 male births for every 100 female births. This cultural preference for sons can be manifested in sex selection, abortion, or withholding of resources from daughters. This bias has both economic and social antecedent, as well as important ethical and demographic consequences. Data on cultural transmission of son preference can be incorporated into formal demographic analysis, linking these data to real-world policy applications. Theoretical models can also aid in predicting the effects of policies. For example, one such model tracked the cultural transmission of the perceived present value of a son relative to daughter, the sex ratio at birth, and their effects on demographic change. The results of this model suggested that the interventions focused on peer-to-peer cultural transmission or the perceived higher value of daughters might complement existing economic incentives to support and educate daughters, with the goal of mitigating the effects of son preference. The literature on the interaction between cultural transmission and formal demography is quite sparse. Given the large variety of customs that relate to birth and death rates in different human societies, population projections for the future needs of diverse populations should incorporate more cultural dynamics than is cultural standing practice. So I'm not gonna go into the discussion phase in this particular article because it's pretty much like a summary. But that is the gist of how culture evolves and why it matters. So for those of you who may have missed the mark and joined us late, it talks about its importance, its evolutionary process, and how it evolved over time. It also threw in some nice jewels and gave us something that we already knew, that you can't use phenotype to classify one's culture. It also has some other jewels in there that people, that biologists need language, like they need linguistics, right? To help them in understanding cultural context, linguistics and customs to help biologists understand cultural context when they're doing their research and their work. All the things that we need to do to help us identify issues in one's culture and hash those out scientifically, we have not gotten to that point because some people don't understand African culture. So they demonize it, or they sound anti-African, or, they no longer identify with what got them here.
As anthropologists, we know that humans have a unique capacity for culture. While other animals might have some culture-like characteristics, we do culture in a much more elaborated way. And although cultures look different from place to place, we know that every human has the same ability to do culture. So one of the questions we might want to ask is, where did we get culture from? How did we develop culture within our lineage? Why do we have it and other animals do not? Otherwise, ask this as, what is the evolution of culture? Now, we've already discussed the characteristics that define culture. Culture is learned, it's symbolic, it's shared, etc. But where do we see these first instances of all of these elements of culture showing up? For this, we have to turn to a lot of different data sets. We can look at the archaeological record, we can look at how humans and animals live today, and when we combine that, a clearer picture starts to emerge of where culture has come from. The first place we can start is by looking at modern human groups that are alive today. And we can see that there's incredible diversity in the types of cultures that exist. Some people live rather simple lives as hunter-gatherers, or at least outwardly simple, so small groups of people who don't have a lot of personal belongings or extremely elaborated technology. Some people are shepherds, some are farmers, and some live in very large urban centers like New York City, where you have millions of people crammed into a relatively small space. it's sometimes appealing or compelling to think of these different types of human societies as representing stages in human cultural evolution. That is, that given enough time, every human society will sort of end up here. We just have to work ourselves through these stages of getting bigger and more complex. The problem with this type of thinking, which is referred to as unilineal evolutionism, meaning one line, all humans evolving along one single trajectory. The problem with this type of thinking is that, first of all, not every group of humans wants to end up in this very complex, urban, industrialized setting. Many people, most people, are quite happy not living in this environment. So to suggest that everyone will eventually get here really denies the agency of the people within cultures. Second of all, assuming that everyone eventually ends up here is somehow suggesting that everyone who is not already in the industrialized world somehow represents previous points in human cultural evolution, as though other people are somehow a stage behind where some of us are today. That's a very ethnocentric way of viewing the world. And it really doesn't take into account all of the complexities that drive cultures to adapt in their own particular way. So as anthropologists, we want to reject this idea of unilineal evolutionism. If we're talking about how culture came about, we have to also consider why culture might look different from place to place. So to first start with this question of where do we get culture, why do we see it in our lineage and not in others, let's start by positioning us, the humans, within our larger family group. As humans, we are primates. So the primates include monkeys, they include apes like gorillas and chimpanzees, also lemurs and tarsiers and lorises. There are lots of primates that are living today. We're going to focus right now, though, on just the apes. So this particular diagram, this is called a cladogram. A cladogram is just a way of representing the evolutionary relationships of a group of animals or plants. And we could fill this up with any groups of animals that we wanted to show how they are related to one another. But for our purposes, we're going to be looking just at the apes. So along the top here, this represents the modern day. And we're going to be positioning the ape groups that are alive today up here. As you continue down the cladogram, this represents periods deeper in time. Now on the left to right axis is evolutionary distance. So the further apart two groups, the more distantly related they are to one another. Let's go ahead and fill in this cladogram for the living apes. So we've got 6 groups of apes that are alive today. Starting on the left, we've got the gibbons. Gibbons are also known as the lesser apes because they're much smaller than the rest of the apes that are alive today. Then we have the orangutans, which live in Southeast Asia, the gorillas from Africa, the bonobos and chimps, also from Central Africa, and finally humans. Now when we see all of these lines on the cladogram, where the lines connect, that suggests a point in the past where there was an ancestor group. So for example, thinking about the chimpanzees and bonobos right here. Bonobos are often called the pygmy chimpanzees. They're a little bit smaller than sort of the normal chimps that we think of. They also live in female-dominated groups, and they're much more peaceful compared to chimpanzees, which are male-dominated and much more aggressive. The two lines between bonobos and chimps join here, which tells us that at some point in the past, probably in the last couple million years, bonobos and chimpanzees shared an ancestor. So this was a time when there were no bonobos and no chimps, but some ancestor group that then split into two, and then each of those two groups diverged and they evolved in their own way. Similarly, this point here, where we see the connection between the chimp-bonobo line and the human line, tells us that at some point in the past, about 7 million years ago, humans, bonobos, and chimps all shared a single ancestor. So none of those 3 groups were alive. There was just this sort of grandfather species that split into 2. One of those groups, or one half of that group, became the humans. The other half became the bonobos and the chimpanzees. Now we want to subdivide this group of apes into some smaller groups. We already mentioned that the gibbons are known as lesser apes because they're smaller, only about 10 to 25 pounds full grown, whereas all of the rest of the apes here are a lot larger. So we call those the great apes, or the hominids with an IDS. Hominids are all of the great apes, so everyone except gibbons, and also all of the ancestors that have existed along their evolutionary history. So we are, as humans, we are apes, we are also hominids. There's one more subdivision to make here, and that is the hominins with an INS. We are the only living hominins on the planet today. But over the past approximately 7 million years, there have been many, many different hominin species. This star represents our last common ancestor with bonobos and chimps. So again, this is that grandfather species that was alive approximately 7 million years ago that split into two. Half went on to evolve to become humans, and the other half evolved into the bonobos and the chimpanzees. Thinking specifically of that hominin line that has been diverged from chimpanzees and bonobos and evolving in their own trajectory for the last 7 million years, here we see a timeline of some of the hominin species that have existed. So 7 million years is over here on the right. Here is our potential last common ancestor. It's a fossil group called Sahelanthropus chadensis. So we think this might have been the grandfather of both us and chimps and bonobos. As we continue through time to the present, we see lots of different hominin groups. And then finally, at the very end here, we have the Homo sapiens, meaning us, the humans. So while we've been split from the rest of the apes for a long time, our species only evolves relatively recently. But all of us are still hominins. So if we agree that we have this last common ancestor with chimpanzees, and for now, Sahelanthropus chadensis is the best candidate for that position. This is the Sahelanthropus chadensis skull. It was found in Chad, which is a country in sort of northern Africa, about 20 years ago. Sahelanthropus chadensis has a lot of ape-like characteristics. It's got this big brow ridge, it's got very apey teeth, but it also has some human characteristics. One of them being a hole in the skull where the spinal cord inserts that's more similar to what we would see in a human. So it looks like this might be that grandfather species, or our last common ancestor. This is an artist's reconstruction of Sahelanthropus chadensis. We don't know exactly what they look like because, of course, they're not alive anymore. They went extinct a long time ago. But this is what we think it might have looked like. So if we agree that this is a human ancestor, and we also agree that all humans have culture, is that enough to say that Sahelanthropus chadensis also had culture? Well, probably not, because all we have to represent this species are a few fossils. And it's impossible to see culture in a fossil or in a bone, because culture is about behavior. So this skull isn't telling us anything about the behavior of this species, and we don't have any other types of artifacts that tell us what they were actually doing. So did this group have culture? There's not any evidence to suggest they did. So at this point, we don't have enough to say, yes, they absolutely did. Let's move forward in time a little bit more, to about 3.5 million years ago. Now, at this time in Africa, there are a number of hominin species, but one of them is a group that we call Australopithecus afarensis. This individual is nicknamed Lucy. And if you've heard about a fossil hominin before, you've probably heard about Lucy. She's one of the most famous fossil hominins ever discovered. She was found in the 1970s, and she was the most complete fossil hominin ever found up to that point. A few years later, in Tanzania in East Africa, a set of footprints were found embedded into volcanic ash crossing the African savanna. So basically, a volcano erupted, and the ash fell on the ground, and then 3 members of this group, Australopithecus afarensis, walked across that ash. It rained a short time after that, which turned the ash into solid rock, preserving these footprints for 3.5 million years. Now we see some big footprints and some small footprints. This looks very much like a group of individuals walking together, and it could very well be a family group. And this looks like, it's hard not to look at this and see something very human if you see a family out for a walk together. So if we say this is a family, is this enough to say that by 3.5 million years ago, we're seeing evidence for culture in these fossilized footprints? Again, probably not. Although this is behavior, it's walking, lots of animals walk, and lots of animals live in family groups. And so it's not really showing us anything special or anything unique. It's definitely cool that these footprints were found, but it's not telling us really about the behavior and the cultural behavior of these individuals. If we really want to try to identify some of the first elements of culture in the hominin lineage, we need to look for indicators of behavior like tool making. The earliest tools that we have are stone tools about 3.3 million years old. We call these Lamequian tools, and these were actually only found a few years ago. Prior to that, we thought these were the oldest type of stone tools. These are called Oldowan tools, and we see them in East Africa starting about 2.6 million years ago. But the recent discovery of Lamequian tools pushes the technology of tool making back almost another million years. Now, I think this is a really strong indicator for early elements of culture. Stone tools are complex enough in making them that it really requires some sort of transmission of knowledge, meaning you have to teach someone how to do this, and you have to be taught how to do it by someone else. And we know that culture is learned. So here we see evidence for learning. We also see the evidence of sharing information. This is adaptive because it would have helped our ancestors access more food resources in their environment. So we're already checking off some of those characteristics of culture just by seeing these first earliest stone tools. However, we don't see any evidence for symbolism. And as we know, symbols are a huge part of human culture. Every element of our culture has extra symbolic layers on top of it, and we don't see evidence for symboling in these more simple stone tools. So this might be the beginning of culture, but it's still not full-blown culture. It's also important to remember that when we're looking at early culture, it's represented by only very small pieces of data. We really only have stone tools and then also the bones that were butchered with those stone tools to serve as evidence for early cultural development. So here you see some stone tools that have existed 2.5 million years ago, 1 million years ago, 10,000 years ago. We can see that they're getting more complex and more refined over time. We can look at animal bones that have been chopped open to get to the marrow inside, or that have been cut by stone tools to access the meat. These are the tiny bits of evidence that we have to go on in order to study early culture. So much of what we know is based on inference. We take these small pieces of data and then try to build a larger narrative about what that means.
So when you're talking about stone tools and you bring yourself to Africa, it is very important for you to understand culture. Don't talk to me about these tools and then disregard one's culture.
To assess our ability to have culture and the development of culture, another data set that we want to bring in is a comparison to our closest living relatives, the other primates. So we already positioned ourselves within the ape group, but now we're going to consider primates more generally. So that includes apes and monkeys and some of the other primates like lemurs and lorises and tarsiers. Humans share with other primates a couple of key characteristics. We all have increased manual dexterity, increased memory capabilities, and altricial young. And we'll go through these one by one. First of all, humans and most primates have increased manual dexterity, including opposable thumbs. This opposable thumbs, sometimes people think that this is something that only humans do. Opposable thumbs just means that we can touch our thumbs to every one of our fingertips. We have a grasping hand. All primates have this grasping hand because our primate ancestors about 60 million years ago used those grasping hands and thumbs to hold onto tree branches. Today, we use our thumbs for things like holding pens and pencils, texting our friends, braiding hair. Most of the things that we do that involves our hands, we use these opposable thumbs. So our hand design has definitely...
Don't talk to me about evolution if you're not going to deal with culture, because then you could be teaching or educating people improperly out of context, and we're not getting the full grasp of the subject matter.
enabled our culture, but it's not unique to us. All primates have these wonderful, fancy hands. Primates also all have increased memory capabilities compared to other mammals and other animals. And in particular, we're looking at the part of the brain that's responsible for memory and for social memory. That is the neocortex. So throughout primates, we all have larger brains than the rest of the animal kingdom, but in particular, our neocortex is larger. And for humans, we have the largest neocortex for our body size compared to all other primates. A few years ago, a couple decades ago, some anthropologists looked at the size of the neocortex relative to the group size that primates were living in. And what they found was that the larger the neocortex in a primate, the larger the social group they lived in. And it's important to have good social memory if you're living in a large social group, because you need to be able to remember all of your interactions with all of the individuals in your group. For example, if I'm a little monkey and I have a piece of fruit that I want to share with a friend, I want to make sure that I give it to the monkey who was sharing fruit with me yesterday, not the monkey that pushed me out of a tree. So we use this large neocortex to have larger social groups, which also means that part of our evolutionary history is for being social. That's one really important element of being human, is that we need to be social with each other. We work best when we engage our brains in social interaction. Finally, humans and other primates have altricial young. This means that our babies are born kind of helpless. They can't do a lot for themselves. We have to feed them, we have to carry them, we have to protect them. We have to do everything for them in the first couple months or years of their life. And again, this is true of all primates, whether you are a human, an orangutan, or a baboon. The reason why our babies are born pretty helpless is because of those large brains. Essentially, mothers don't have the energetic resources to stay pregnant long enough to support developing a big baby primate brain. So mothers have to give birth to babies whose brains have not finished growing. And then most of that brain growth happens after birth. We can compare this to animals like horses, deer, elephants. All of those animals, when they're born, their brains are pretty much developed, and they can already get up and start moving around within a few hours of birth. We call that precocious young. So humans and other primates have altricial young. We have to be taken care of by our parents, by our families for the first couple years of life, but that's also okay because that's the period of time where we go through the enculturation process, right? That's when we learn our culture. There are a number of things, though, that humans do that are unique, things that we don't share in common with the other primates. So, for example, humans cooperate and share much more than other primates do. Here we have a picture of an Amish barn raising, where dozens of people get together to build a barn in a single day. You do not see this level of cooperation in primates. Human women also live past their reproductive age, right? Women go through a period of their life called menopause, and then they survive for several decades after that. We don't see menopause in other primates. For the most part, when a primate female is no longer able to reproduce, that marks the end of her life. There's not really a point in being alive if you are not having babies, if you are a chimp or a monkey or a lemur. But in humans, we do live past the age when we can have babies. So why would that be? Why is it important for women to live past the age when they can have children? The answer is probably something to do with the importance of grandmothers. So grandmothers and grandfathers, being able to help your children take care of their children increases your own sort of evolutionary importance. So it preserves your own genes by making sure that your kids raise their kids successfully. Human women also have concealed ovulation, meaning that we don't advertise when we are able to get pregnant. Other primates, however, do not conceal their ovulation. So here we have a picture of a female chimpanzee, and you'll notice this right down here. This is her genital swelling. Genital swelling is essentially a big advertisement to all the males in the group. Now is the time to get me pregnant. I'm ovulating right now. I got to get pregnant if I'm going to have a baby in the next season. So why don't human women do this? We don't give off any signals to say, I'm ready to get pregnant. It probably has to do with female choice. So for a female chimpanzee like this, when she's giving off this big display that she is in the time of her cycle to get pregnant, she's not really going to have an option. She's not going to get to choose which male it is gets her pregnant. She'll get pregnant by whatever male gets to her at the right time, whatever male is able to keep her away from everyone else, but the choice is not hers. However, in human women, because we can hide ovulation from those around us, we have more choice in who we mate with when we mate with them. So female choice is probably a driving evolutionary factor here. Finally, humans have much more complicated kinship systems, meaning we recognize more members of our family, and we have more symbolic relationships around those family relationships. And we get married. Every human society has some form of marriage, although it looks different from place to place. Primates don't do that. It would be adorable to see a chimpanzee in a tuxedo, but primates do not get married. So while there are a number of things that we share with our primate relatives because of our shared evolutionary history, there are also a number of things that humans do that are unique. If we look specifically at chimpanzees, we can see that they do have many characteristics in their behavioral repertoire that are very culture-ish. Many chimpanzee groups make and use tools. So some chimps crack open nuts with two stones called anvils and hammerstones. That's what we see up here. A mother chimp using two rocks, and then she'll set a nut in between them to crack it open. And then those nuts are eaten by her babies and by herself. Chimps also do something called termite fishing, where they'll take a blade of grass or a little twig, and they'll stick it into an insect mound. As the insects latch onto the stick, the chimps pull it out, and then they can just eat the termites or the insects off of the stick. Chimpanzees also build nests to keep themselves off the forest floor at night. They hunt meat, and one of their favorite things to eat is actually monkey. So they'll go out in these big hunting expeditions and then share meat between themselves. They also throw objects in signs of display. And I've included some YouTube links to videos showing some of these behaviors. Now, very similar to those early stone tool making abilities of our hominin ancestors about 3.3 million years ago, in these chimpanzee behaviors, we see some elements of culture, right? These types of traditions, these behaviors, they require teaching. They require sharing. They're definitely adaptive because they help chimps get more food resources. But just like with those early stone tools 3.3 million years ago, what we're missing here are symbols. We don't have any evidence that in the wild, chimpanzees create and use symbols. So if we were to ask the question, do chimps have culture? We could answer this in a variety of ways. You could support an answer that chimps have some characteristics of culture, but they still are lacking this one very, very important element, which is symbols. And turning specifically to humans, we know that humans first evolved in Africa. Until very recently, the earliest human fossils, so the earliest Homo sapiens fossils, were found here in Ethiopia in East Africa at a site called Omo Kibish. And they're about 200,000 years old. So it has been the predominant story for a while now that all humans evolved in East Africa about 200,000 years ago. Now, in 2017, not too long ago, new fossils were identified from Morocco at a site called Jebel Irhoud. Those fossils are about 300,000 years old. So that pushes back the evolution of Homo sapiens another 100,000 years into the past. And it's likely that as we continue doing research, the story of when and where exactly humans evolved is going to be changing a bit here and there. But it's pretty certain, I'm going to say with 98% confidence, that the first humans, the first Homo sapiens who looked like us, who have the same proportions, the same basic physical characteristics, the same anatomical characteristics, those all come from Africa around 300,000 years ago. If we look at the genes of humans all over the world today, the genetic patterns suggest that all humans do come from Africa at least 200,000 years ago. Okay, so basically we all come from here, and then over time, some populations have spread out from Africa. So we have an African ancestor, all of us, and then some groups have spread on and have carried their genes into new places. And so we can use DNA to reconstruct those migration paths. So it's very clear that we have this African ancestry. So it should be pretty obvious then that culture comes from Africa, right? If all humans come from Africa and all humans have culture, then, all right, culture comes from Africa. And yet there has been a lot of debate around this fact over, the history of anthropology and archaeology. And so we need to bring in some of that history to sort of understand the state of the debate. In the early days of archaeological research, most people who practiced archaeology were European and some Americans. But these were people who were French, German, English, and they tended to focus their research on those countries, on Western Europe. Now, for hundreds of years, people have known that there were these beautiful cave paintings in places like France and Spain and Germany. There are really beautiful artifacts that have been discovered in these places, including really nice stone tools and elements of personal ornamentation. So these would be like pendants that you could put on a necklace. All of these things are clearly symbolic, right? A symbol is something that represents something else. This picture of a horse represents a horse, and maybe it represents something else as well. But here we have very, very clear symboling, and symbols are an essential part of the definition of culture. Now, all of these discoveries that have been located in Europe date to 40,000 years ago or less. Okay, so just to recap, we have humans in Africa 300,000 years ago looking fully human, so physically human. But it's not until 40,000 years ago in Europe that we see humans acting fully symbolic and culture-y. So how do we explain that? Well, for the early archaeologists, it made perfect sense to them because these were Western European men and they had preconceived ideas about how great it was to be European, right? They would look at these things and say, well, if we want to understand humanity, like, of course, this is what we're going to focus on. And this supported their own ideas of the importance of Europe because they already had ideas about sort of a hierarchy of human evolution, human culture, in which they were positioned at the top. Now, if this sounds problematic, it's because it is, right? There's something that really needs to be questioned further because there's a lot of bias going into this. Africa, by comparison, did not see a lot of archaeological research. And those people who did go to Africa trying to understand human prehistory found a very different sort of archaeological record. They weren't seeing these big, beautiful cave paintings. They weren't seeing all of these instances of personal ornamentation. Instead, a lot of people were finding just kind of grotty looking rocks. I mean, some of these are stone tools, but they don't look all of that impressive. Now, this is a collection that was collected by a British guy in southern Africa, in the country of Zimbabwe, about 100 years ago. These collections are now stored at the American Museum of Natural History here in New York City. But there just wasn't as much emphasis on studying Africa because people already assumed that Europe was the most important part in the story of human evolution. And so there came to be this belief that although we all evolved in Africa, physically evolved in Africa, about 200,000 years ago, or maybe a little bit before, that we didn't culturally evolve until much later, around 40,000 years ago, and we see that in Europe. So there's this big gap between when our bodies evolved and when our brains evolved. And this is called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. The Upper Paleolithic is a period of time in Europe, starting about 40,000 years ago, when you see humans doing these really beautiful, complex things. So this Upper Paleolithic Revolution was based on what archaeologists were finding in Europe. And so they developed a sort of list of traits that you should expect to find whenever you have humans who are fully culturally evolved. Things like personal ornaments, or art, or blade stone tools, which is like a specialized kind of stone knife. You'd see people eating more types of foods and having more distinct regional technologies. So it's like each culture, each group had its own specific way of doing things. So people would take this set of characteristics and then try to apply it to the rest of the world. And when they didn't find all of these things in Africa or Asia or Australia, they would say, see, it's because only Europe has this modern behavior. We see it there first. So again, it supported the idea that the first truly, fully modern cultural humans came from Europe or developed in Europe or Asia. It supported that idea of European cultural superiority. So one more time, if you have a problem with this idea, then you're on the right track. This is a very problematic idea. Some anthropologists have tried to find a way around what are the very obvious ethnocentric and even racist implications of the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. So one of those alternatives is called the genetic brain rewiring hypothesis. This is the idea that around 45 or 50,000 years ago, a light switch sort of turned on in the brains of humans all over the world. And that light switch turning on, that was the culture switch. And so with that culture switch comes symbolism, it comes language. And so it was just this, like, everywhere in the world, people suddenly became smart. And I mean, it's not really sudden. It's basically suggesting that, we have humans in East Africa who spread out throughout the world. And then in one of those groups, there's a genetic mutation that causes someone to become smart and cultured. And then that genetic mutation spreads into the rest of the world by populations breeding with each other and spreading that positive genetic adaptation. The problem with this is that people have arrived in Australia by at least 50,000 years ago and probably quite a bit earlier. But it seems from all the evidence that we have that once humans made it into Australia, sea level rose and basically cut them off from the rest of the world. And so if that genetic adaptation, if that genetic light switch flipped on after Australia's cut off from the rest of the world, then that beneficial smart genetic component would never have been able to make it to Australia, which means that Australians would have been sort of left out of that cultural light switch being turned on. And we know that's not true. We know that Indigenous Australians have the exact same capacity for culture as any other human. So the genetic brain rewiring hypothesis is a good attempt to try to explain cultural development, but it doesn't quite get us to where we need to be. Instead, we can turn to an idea that was really synthesized and put forth only in the year 2000, which is really not that long ago. And it was in a paper called The Revolution That Wasn't. This is in reference again to that Upper Paleolithic Revolution. So these two authors, Alison Brooks and Sally McBrearty, said in this really big comprehensive paper that what we see when we look at the archaeological record, it's not that smart, cultured, intelligent, modern humans suddenly start acting smart and intelligent and cultured in Europe 40,000 years ago just because they became smart at that moment, but rather that all of those things that seemingly made European humans very smart and cultured and modern, those all actually developed in Africa much earlier. And so it's not that humans suddenly become smart with a snap of the fingers when they get to Europe. It's that they have been becoming cultured. They had been becoming intelligent throughout tens of thousands of years of evolution in Africa. All of those cultural characteristics accumulate over time. Okay? So what this chart is showing us are all of the characteristics that had been thought to represent true cultural activity in humans. The red box represents 40,000 years ago, okay? And that was the time when these traits appear in Europe. But what we see is that on these black lines, we see the length of the trait existing in Africa. And each one of these things that supposedly made humans in Europe really, really smart actually existed in Africa for much, much longer. So beads, they only appear in Europe 40,000 years ago, but they've existed in Africa for 82,000 years. Points are made in Europe 40,000 years ago, but they existed in Africa 250,000 years ago. Blades are, again, these like elongated stone tools that are a bit difficult to make. They take a very specific set of techniques. We see them in Europe 40,000 years ago, but they extend back in Africa to at least 280,000 years ago. And actually, some new finds are pushing that back to 500,000 years ago. So everything that made humans look special in Europe actually existed in Africa much, much earlier. What this means is that to be a cultured, behaviorally modern human is not about being European. It has nothing to do with evolution that took place in Europe. Instead, all of our smarts, all of our ability to have culture comes from the fact that we all evolved in Africa. It comes from our shared African ancestry. So if we want to understand what it means to be a modern, cultured human, we have to focus on Africa. We have to focus on that aspect of our shared ancestry. So why has there been so much privilege given to Europe and not to Africa? Why has Africa been ignored as the source of our cultural innovation? Well, for starters, Africa is huge. Africa is a massive continent, and there hasn't been as much work done in Africa as there have in other parts of the world. So for example, here is the outline of France set within the African continent. Now, I would guess, but I think it's a pretty good guess, that in just this tiny little corner of France, there have probably been at least 100 different archaeological projects investigating human prehistory there. I would also guess that there have probably been less than 100 archaeological projects in this whole region of sort of southern central Africa. So there's a real disparity in the amount of attention that's been played to Western Europe as opposed to Africa. That means that the record is just biased. We don't have an equivalent amount of data from Africa as we do from other parts of the world, which means that other parts of the world look more important just because more work has been done there. So ultimately, how do we explain the fact that things look very different and they look very sudden in Europe 40,000 years ago, even if we've agreed that all of these cultural elements have developed in Africa at earlier times? Well, for starters, we have to recognize that Europe and Africa are very different places. And so it would be unreasonable to expect that humans living in those two places to do things exactly the same way. If you're living in Europe, there are different things that you have to adapt to in your environment. If you're in Africa, there's a different set of constraints that you have to deal with. So life is going to be different between these two places just automatically because of the environment and the climate. The second part of that is that when those African populations migrated into Europe 40,000 years ago, so that's the first time humans are getting into Europe, they are bringing with them all of the things that they accumulated and learned through their development in Africa. And when they get to Europe, into this new environment, there's already another hominin species there. And those were the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals are our European cousins. So at the time when we were evolving in Africa, Homo sapiens was evolving in Africa, the Neanderthals were evolving in Europe. So when members of our species migrated into Europe, not only did they have to adjust to a new environment, they now had to compete with a species that was very similar to them, and they were already experts at living in that environment. And so they had to adapt culturally very, very quickly. And all of the things that we see in Europe, all of that symbolism that we see with the cave paintings, with the ornamentation, those are all parts of the human survival system in Europe. But it was all things, all characteristics, all abilities that those humans brought with them through their evolutionary history in Africa. Okay? So if we think about this concept of unilineal evolutionism again, thinking back to the very beginning of this video, how do we resist? How do we reject unilineal evolutionism? How do we explain the fact that there are humans who live in very different cultures and very different societies today? It's not that anyone is stuck in the past or anyone is more advanced or less advanced. It's simply that every culture adapts to its own needs. Every group of people has different requirements for survival. Every environment has its own circumstances, and people respond to those circumstances. It's unreasonable to expect, folks living in the Kalahari Desert as hunter-gatherers to set up a McDonald's. It just doesn't make sense in that particular cultural setting. So people look different from place to place, not because any one group is more advanced than another, but because we're all equally advanced in finding the best way to meet our own needs. It's kind of amazing. Every culture is an accumulation of thousands of years of adapting to best ensure the group's survival. So it's only reasonable that we look different from place to place. Now, if you want to explore this idea a little bit more, the role of geography and the role of environment in influencing cultures, I'd recommend checking out this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. It's not perfect. There are a lot of anthropologists and archaeologists who disagree with some elements of this book, but it's still a really, I think, cohesive narrative about how geography and climate impact the development of human cultures, and why it is that some human cultures have persisted for a very long time and have acquired a great amount of wealth and power and have ultimately, conquered much of the planet, while others have not. So it's not a perfect book, but it gives us a really nice sort of framework for understanding how important environment and climate is on the development of human cultures. So to sum this all up, the evolution of culture, where did it come from? When did it come from? Culture, as we see it in humans today, is absolutely the result of our evolution within the African continent. As humans have been spread out throughout the African continent for the last 300,000 years, groups have developed different strategies, different ways of surviving and coping and thriving in their environments. This slow accumulation of characteristics is ultimately what ended up being transported to other parts of the world. So as humans have migrated out of Africa, they've taken their cultural capabilities with them elsewhere. Culture truly did evolve within our shared African ancestry, and any culture that we see around the world today is due to the very specific and wonderful circumstances of our African evolution.
I need to find the best way to learn math.
Let me run this back real quick. Because somebody asked me, who was the sister, right? This is the sister. Shalia Nightingale. This is the sister. You can look her up if you want to. Does she look like a sister to you? Do she look like a sister to you? See, I had y'all fooled. Who was the sister doing a presentation? Who was the sister doing this? Who was the sister doing that? Here she go right here. Is that still a sister? It's not a sister saying this. It's not a black person that's saying this. This is a white. They don't listen to Africans. People not listening to black people. They calling it blackology. So is it blackology when this white lady say it to you? Is it blackology when she say it to you? Y'all wasn't ready for that. Admit it. You wasn't ready for it. You wasn't ready for it. Just tell the truth. You was not ready for this conversation. from this white woman. You just knew you had somebody black. Oh, Sean over there with the blackology. Oh, he doing this. He doing no. She said something in the earliest onset that went over a lot of people's heads. So what I want to do is I want to go back and I want to play the first few minutes of this just so people can actually catch what she was saying and we can actually have a discussion about it. I do have another article that I wanted to get into, but I'm going to draw this all the way out and I'm not going to make it long. So I'm going to breeze through that article and then we'll deal with that. But I do want to get into the first few minutes of this. So let me run this back.
While other animals might have some culture-like characteristics, we do culture in a much more elaborated way. And although cultures look different from place to place, we know that every human has the same ability to do culture. So one of the questions we might want to ask is, where did we get culture from? How did we develop culture within our lineage? Why do we have it and other animals do not? Otherwise, we could ask this as, what is the evolution of culture? Now, we've already discussed the characteristics that define culture. Culture is learned, it's symbolic, it's shared, etc. But where do we see these first instances of all of these elements of culture showing up? For this, we have to turn to a lot of different data sets. We can look at the archaeological record, we can look at how humans and animals live today, and when we combine that, a clearer picture starts to emerge of where culture has come from. The first place we can start is by looking at modern human groups that are alive today. And we can see that there's incredible diversity in the types of cultures that exist. Some people live rather simple lives as hunter-gatherers, or at least outwardly simple, so small groups of people who don't have a lot of personal belongings or extremely elaborated technology. Some people are shepherds, some are farmers, and some live in very large urban centers like New York City, where you have millions of people crammed into a relatively small space. It's sometimes appealing or compelling to think of these different types of human societies as representing stages in human cultural evolution. That is, that given enough time, every human society will sort of end up here. We just have to work ourselves through these stages of getting bigger and more complex. The problem with this type of thinking, which is referred to as unilineal evolutionism, meaning one line, all humans evolving along one single trajectory. The problem with this type of thinking is that, first of all, not every group of humans wants to end up in this very complex urban industrialized setting. Many people, most people, are quite happy not living in this environment. So to suggest that everyone will eventually get here really denies the agency of the people within cultures. Second of all, assuming that everyone eventually ends up here is somehow suggesting that everyone who is not already in the industrialized world somehow represents previous points in human cultural evolution, as though other people are somehow a stage behind where some of us are today. That's a very ethnocentric way of viewing the world. And it really doesn't take into account all of the complexities that drive cultures to adapt in their own particular way. So as anthropologists, we want to reject this idea of unilineal evolutionism. If we're talking about how culture came about, we have to also consider why culture might look different from place to place. So to first start with this question of where do we get culture, why do we see it in our lineage and not in others, let's start by positioning us, the humans, within our larger family group.
I have to
As
run.
humans, we are.
I have to run it back. I really need y'all to take in the first few minutes of this bill. I need you to take in the first 3 minutes of this bill. I need you to listen closely to what this lady is saying, because here lies an issue in multiple conversations that have been had when people demonize African culture or African people or African traditions or African customs and say that they haven't come into what they call the space age. Not everybody wants to live in the space age. Not everybody wants to develop like New York. Not everybody wants to live in the realm of what you think the advancement is.
Showing up. For this, we have to turn to a lot of different data sets. We can look at the archaeological record, we can look at how humans and animals live today, and when we combine that, a clearer picture starts to.
This is how I know you don't study humans. I was told today that people don't study culture, they study human behavior. Well, if you was studying human behavior and I don't understand how you can study human behavior or humans and not get into culture. I don't understand that because you're missing stuff. You're missing a key element in anthropological studies. You're missing that. And for me to hear that, I'm like scratching my head over here like, what? And to ignore culture is very key. It shows your ignorance. But if you're studying hominids and the early man and all of these things, how could you miss this?
Emerge of where culture has come from. The first place we can start is by looking at modern human groups that are alive today. And we can see that there's incredible diversity in the types of cultures that exist. Some people live rather simple lives as hunter-gatherers, or at least outwardly simple, so small groups of people who don't have a lot of personal belongings or extremely elaborated technology. Some people are shepherds, some are farmers, and some live in very large urban centers like New York City, where you have millions of people crammed into a relatively small space. It's sometimes appealing or compelling to think of these different types of human societies as representing stages in human cultural evolution. That is, that given enough time, every human society will sort of end up here. We just have to work ourselves through these stages of getting bigger and more complex. The problem with this type of thinking, which is referred to as unilineal evolutionism, meaning one line, all humans evolving along one single trajectory. The problem with this type of thinking is that, first of all, not every group of humans wants to end up in this very complex, urban, industrialized setting. Many people, most people, are quite happy not living in this environment. So to suggest that everyone will eventually get here really denies the agency of the people within cultures. Second of all,
denying the agencies of the people in culture. So, because they're not advancing in the manner or the way that you would like for them to advance, you just violated. Scientifically speaking, you're out of line. And you continue to commit this. Unchallenged, unscathed, all of that. But you're not in the echo chamber.
Of all of these elements of culture showing up. For this, we have to turn to a lot of different data sets. We can look at the archaeological record, we can look at how humans and animals live today, and when we combine that, a clearer picture starts to emerge of where culture has come from. The first place we can start is by looking at modern human groups that are alive today. And we can see that there's incredible diversity in the types of cultures that exist. Some people live rather simple lives as hunter-gatherers, or at least outwardly simple, so small groups of people who don't have a lot of personal belongings or extremely elaborated technology. Some people are shepherds, some are farmers, and some live in very large urban centers like New York City, where you have millions of people crammed into a relatively small space. It's sometimes appealing or compelling to think of these different types of human societies as representing stages in human cultural evolution. That is, that given enough time, every human society we'll sort of end up here. We just have to work ourselves through these stages of getting bigger and more complex. The problem with this type of thinking, which is referred to as unilineal evolutionism, meaning one line, all humans evolving along one single trajectory. The problem with this type of thinking is that, first of all, not every group of humans wants to end up in this very complex urban industrialized setting. Many people, most people, are quite happy not living in this environment. So to suggest that everyone will eventually get here really denies the agency of the people within cultures. Second of all, assuming that everyone eventually ends up here is somehow suggesting that everyone who is not already in the industrialized world somehow represents previous points in human cultural evolution, as though other people are somehow a stage behind where some of us are today. That's a very ethnocentric way of viewing the world. And it really doesn't take into account all of the complexities that drive cultures to adapt in their own particular way. So as anthropologists, we want to reject this idea of unilineal evolutionism. If we're talking about how culture came about, we have to also consider why culture might look different from place to place.
See, when I'm studying, right, I try to learn from every field. So I know when we're talking about humans, when you look at humans and the behavior of humans, and you're studying early man as they evolve, you have to understand the intricate pieces that make up the totality of the argument. Linguistics is a key. Culture is a key. Not only do we have to look at the genetics, the genes, right? We got to look at all the other variations. When we're making an argument against whether whoever it may be dealing with historical perspectives and otherwise, we have to use anthropology. In the field of anthropology, there's a subset of about 6 different subtopics that make up that, right? Overall gesture. So we have to deal in those subsets. To deny that is unscientific. This is why I say some people are just not science advocates. How could you be if you don't understand research methodology and what the fields require you to do in order to substantiate a solid argument? Dismissing a critical piece of evidence is very unscientific. So to dismiss culture is very unscientific. As a matter of fact, experts don't even look at you the same. But you think that you're quoting experts that are actually supportive of your bias. I'm trying to show y'all how science works. I'm trying to show y'all how this evolutionary process from an anthropological perspective works. I'm trying to show y'all how to revisit history the correct way and why these subfields are very important in the overall context of the conversations. You just heard me read an article to you that was published earlier in a journal about cultural context. While biologists use cultural context, use linguistics, use customs as an intricate piece to help them solve what they're researching. Some of y'all went on here earlier, and you know you're gonna have to go back and really get into the study to actually understand what I was actually talking about when I was getting into this particular article. Okay, so I'm gonna hit you with the line that I was referring to. Okay. Here we explore the ways in which cultural evolutionary theory and its application enhance our understanding of human history and human biology. focusing on the links between cultural evolutionary theory and population genetics, human behavioral ecology, and demography. Throughout, we give examples of efforts to apply theory to data, linking models of cultural evolution to empirical studies of genetics and language, archaeology, and anthropology. For example, studies of cultural factors, including language and customs, help biologists interpret patterns of genetic evolution that might be misrepresented if the cultural context were not taken into account. Finally, we outlined several societal implications of cultural evolutionary theory. So when we go back to the whole argument about Nzinga of Angola, if we don't use cultural context, we then don't understand what the hell we're reading. So we can make the assertions when we're using snippets and cherry picking to make arguments. It is very fallible. It's full of fallacies. It's incorrect. It's bad research methodology. When it's not in context, you don't understand what you're talking about. You are assuming. You are asserting and projecting your emotions into history. We ain't even got to take it there. We can take it to the whole statement about the damn British being heroes. We ain't got to stop there. We can keep on going through the critical error after critical error after critical error after critical error after critical error. Why? Because there's no research methodology. There's no willingness to study African culture. I don't have to read those books. I can just go read what the people are saying about the books. I ain't got to go read those books. We back on SETI. So before I transition, I do want to take a shot. Is real black atheism dead? Because for years it was on the rise. It seems that as of 2022, real black atheism has died, has lost its way, is no longer on the rise. Because the research methodology and the intricate pieces of science are not being upheld and pushed forward. When you make critical mistakes and you make bullshit ass arguments, you lose your way. I'm not giving anyone my side of any argument or any attestation regarding any information that has gone on lately. I'm just going to tell you right now, if your methodology is flawed, I ain't fucking with it. Straight up. Because it says right here, for example, studies of cultural factors, including language and customs, help biologists interpret patterns of genetic evolution that might be misinterpreted if the cultural context were not taken into account. Cultural context. You know, the key to all of these arguments is cultural context. We ran the Hebrews out of Egypt because of cultural context, linguistics, and primary sources. We ran the Hebrews out of West Africa because of linguistics and primary sources. We ran them out of Central and South because of primary sources. What are you talking about over there? I ain't even got to listen to understand that there's a breakdown in the model of research methodology, no matter who's on it. You can say 1,000 things. Oh, look what I find. You can Google your ass off to find things that support your bias. But are you going to purchase the books and do the work to read the books and actually extract the claims out of the book and then deal with them correctly? No, you're not. You're going to shortcut the shit out of it for views. I don't play with scholarship the way that you do. It's not even a game. We're supposed to be advancing our people, not having them hung up in ignorance. So I ask again, is real black atheism dead? Or is it still on the rise? Because real black atheism supports Africa and African culture, and black atheism does not. I learned that in a book that I read. Hold on, let me get the book. I read this in a book called The Chronology of Human Evolution. It was written in 2016. Yeah, people can change and they can evolve and grow, but in this book, since it hasn't changed or been updated or edited, in this book, it basically goes out and it says, and just let me make sure that I'm actually clear. I want to get this. It says, like European atheists, black atheists refuse to acknowledge the ancient wisdom of our culture and the reality that God was a manifestation of nature and comes out in the minds of men. That's what it says. It says, my interest in real black atheism was magnified after joining the Real Black Atheists of Atlanta. The group was an excellent platform for individual interest in traditional African culture as a means of networking, sharing, and educating each other on African-centered atheism. Around that time, I also joined the Black Atheist group, thinking the group would also allow me to connect with people who shared my same beliefs. However, as I become more acquainted with some of the group members, it became more and more apparent that, like European atheists, black atheists also refused to acknowledge that nature was the foundation of African spiritual systems. Like European atheists, black atheists refused to acknowledge the ancient wisdom of our culture and the reality that God was a manifestation of nature and comes out in the minds of men. In many ways, black atheist groups was worse than some of the white atheist groups because they not only reject nature, they also rejected the validity of real black atheism. Of course, the failure to acknowledge the validity of real black atheism as an African paradigm is directly correlated with the religious indoctrination in the community. As a result, I was forced to deal with the scrutiny that was equally distributed, but that's apparent is both atheists and theists regard real black atheism as an invalid premise and reject the notion that there are differences between an atheism and a real black atheism. Given this, I decided to publish this booklet to explain the meaning of real black atheism and reestablish the importance of the restoration of our culture. I just threw the book because it's supposed to be a restoration of our culture. So is real black atheism alive, on the rise, or dead? Because real black atheism deals with culture. So the minute that you say that you ain't effing with Africa and F Africa this and that, and your verbiage begins to be more anti-African in your sentiment, it's no longer real black atheism, because real black atheism stands on the fundamental principle of culture. Aha. Aha. You didn't think that I would go there. So I went and got a white lady to put culture in your face and teach you about culture for 50 minutes to let you know and line it up that you're actually out of pocket. And how how significant culture was. Not only did I go get someone to lecture you on culture, I went and got scientific articles that are published in journals regarding the conversation so that it could be advanced even further. I didn't just sit here and start talking and feeling some type of way and expressing my emotions while my barber gave me an edge up. You seen the title, Archaeology of Human Evolution. I was just in anthropology. Now I'm in archaeology of human evolution. This is how science works. I'm not playing games. Archaeology is the study of human behavior through material what? Through material culture. The things we rely on for survival. Behavioral changes was likely a driven factor in the evolution of our species. And archaeology, therefore, plays a central role in understanding human origins from the beginning of the known archaeological records some 2.5 million years ago. From its origins to subsequent diversification, the material record of humoral behavior innovation provides an essential learning tool for understanding human behavioral diversity and also serves as a gateway to critical thinking and education. So, what is archaeology? It is a subdiscipline of anthropology, which is the study of people, particularly human biological and what? Behavior variations in present as well as the past. Most specifically, archaeology is the reconstruction of the ancient behavior from the things people left where? Behind. When combined with the study of biological changes that the human lineage has undergone over the last several million years, archaeology provides an important part of our understanding of the evolutionary success of modern humans and Homo sapiens. You say you're studying humans. How could you study the evolution of humans throughout history and avoid the material culture? The job of an archaeologist can be a difficult one. Archaeologists studies people's material culture, the things that are made, modified, or used by humans or our ancestors, generally referred to as hominins. The study of material culture includes examining artifacts, portable items such as baskets or hammers, and features which are non-portable things such as buildings or fireplaces. Equally important to the archaeologists are contextual. What? Contextual. Who? Contextual. Say it again. Contextual clues that are often learned only through painstakingly, careful excavations. These clues include the location of the found artifacts inside a temple, grave, or trash pile, and their associations with other artifacts. Are hammers always found with an anvil or environment? Do the associated animals suggest humans were living in a subarctic tundra or a heavily forested valley? Imagine the difficulty encountered if someone were to reconstruct your life, likes, dislikes, and habits from the things that you own, and you begin to get a sense of what archaeology is all about. Throw out half of, listen, they just told you how to study humans. Imagine the difficulty encountered if someone were to reconstruct your life, likes, dislikes, and habits from the things that you own, and you begin to get a sense of what archaeology is all about. Throw out half or more of those things made of perishable materials like cloth, wood, etc. Jumble them up with your neighbor's possessions and those of their great grandchildren, and you begin to get a clearer sense of the task at hand. How then do archaeologists know what they think they know. Like geology, archaeology is a historical what? It's a historical science, ladies and gentlemen. A historical science that requires contextual clues, that deals with human behavior through material culture, connecting the dots. As we cannot observe the past directly, archaeologists approach it by setting up analogs, conditions through experimentation and observation. For example, if we or you wanted, let me make sure I'm right. For example, what if you wanted to know how stone tools was made? To answer this question, some archaeologists have conducted a series of practical learning experiments in which they make the tools themselves, thereby understanding the process of manufacturing stone implements from the beginning to the end. You see the methodology that is required for them to understand how stone tools were made? They would put themselves through that scrutiny to be able to make sure that they can actually do that themselves, to understand the process that our earliest hominids went through to make those stone tools. Not get in line up and talk about some stuff and play on people's ignorance because of your emotional perspective and your insane biases, to be so anti something that you miss the key element of the entire argument. So likewise, how do archaeologists determine if the bones found at a site as the result of a hominid dinners versus those left behind by other animals? Archaeologists have conducted controlled experiments in which bones are fed to hyenas and other animals in captivity and in the wild, carefully studying the remains for traces to distinguish the marks made by these and other animals from those made by humans. Do you understand what is going on here? In the field of in this field, they are basically telling you, oh, we know what we know because through experiments, we've already done these practices. We know what animals do to flesh and the marks that they make on bones. And we know how humans eat, and we know the marks that are made by humans. So we could distinguish if this was eaten by an animal of some sort or by a hominin. Consider archaeologists interested in learning what early campsites looked like. To address this, scientists have studied from an archaeological perspective living groups of hunter gatherer groups recently operating in Australia and Southern Africa and elsewhere, providing a comparative baseline of what to expect. Indeed, this spirit of comparison is in many ways at the foot of prehistoric archaeology. It wasn't until contact with the stone tool equipped populations in the New World that Renaissance Europeans living in an agrarian society with metal tools recognized that the strangely shaped stones that had attributed to lightning strikes or fairies were in fact stone tools from their own forgotten hunter and gathering past. So, what's the relevance of archaeology to evolution? What you think? The archaeological record provides a unique long-term view of evolution of human behavior. The study of human evolution includes an examination of the physical, genetic, and behavioral variations of the hominid lineage since we diverged from other apes some 7 million years ago or so. Although the shape of fossilized bones does record major changes in hominid behavior, such as habitually upright posture, it is not until about 2.5 million years with the first appearance of archaeological record that we have abundant evidence for a more complete range of early human behaviors. Whereas morphological changes are the outcome of selective pressure acting on several generations, artifacts can record snapshots of the past, such as the time it took to make stone tool, butcher an animal carcass, and transport meat back to friends and family. In addition to providing a potentially different time perspective on the past, the relatively abundant archaeological traces from about 2.5 million years onward signal our increasing reliance on material culture as a key element of human survival and socialization. Unlike most other animals, humans have a long relied extensively on material items material items for basic survival needs, like tools for hunting and cutting, as we lack, for example, the claws of sharp canine teeth of most carnivores. In addition to a complex knowledge of animal behavior and plant properties, human hunting and gathering involves bows, arrows, traps, digging sticks, and other items of material culture. What? Of what material culture? You're studying humans without studying their culture? Are you freaking serious? Indeed, the earliest archaeological traces suggest hominids used tools to gain access to food, and that natural selection may have favored those hominid groups with readiest access to meat, marrow, and other food items more readily obtainable with tools. To date, the earliest archaeological traces are stone tools for sediments that are approximately 2.5 million years old and found in Gono, Ethiopia. Listen, I put this source, which is a real good source, in the description of the video. I'm not going to go through this and keep us here for another hour. It's a 10-page article with some nice information regarding uh, archaeology, dealing with human archaeology, that whole aspect, okay? So we know what we're dealing with here, and it brings it out here. This has everything to do with humans. So when we're studying humans, we also got to be studying the humans' what? Material culture. Both sources are in the description of the video. Straight like that. And this lady, Sheila Nightingale, who you called a sister, the video is in there too. Because some people are going to ask me, where's those sources that you had on the screen? Well, you have them. I don't hide anything from anyone. I source up. That's why I don't shut up. And I know what I'm doing. So the question remains, is real black atheism dead, on the rise, or still alive? Because black atheism doesn't care about material culture. It definitely does not care about African culture or Africa at all. And it damn sure ain't. Listen, everything is up for scrutiny. Everything should be put under a microscope. All teachings, no matter what, we should look at Africa and scrutinize it just as we would scrutinize any other subject matter. I'm all for that. There's a will, there's a way. So I cannot skip steps. Let me do this. So let's use this for example. So of course, I've been on a tangent with COVID and beating up claims and things of that nature. What if I stepped in those claims and I never found the origin of those sources? And I just bounced around and I did certain things a particular way. And my conclusion was one thing, but I got to my conclusion falsely because I made some errors. And those errors would have made a more solid foundation. I would have made a more solid foundation if I did not have those errors and I addressed them appropriately. What I'm saying is, I had to read a whole bunch of everything about SARS-CoV-2, all the pseudoisms and myths, and then I was able to address them appropriately. I have demonstrated several times on Science with Sean how to actually critique and do this research. I have. It behooves me that it is okay to skip steps now and not have no actual sources to criticize something that you haven't read, or to cherry pick, which is a fallacy. There's a cherry picking fallacy. First of all, if you're going to speak to a claim, you need to understand how to address what is a claim and what is not. We're going to learn something. I'm expecting that we're going to learn something tomorrow from Kofi. I don't know what time or when that will occur, but we are. What I have demonstrated today is the evolution of culture, the significance of culture. And then I put a white lady in your face to say all the things that some black people have been saying to you for the past few months, or especially since this whole pushback began on the teachings of the Congo up until this point, that they don't have no problems like the people that actually in the barbershop do. I had to use a white lady to teach you about culture, bro. That is sad. Because it was too much blackology going on. I had to go get the white lady to say it for you. Like, yo, like these people talking about African culture are not tripping. You tripping for thinking that these people gotta be living like you and do all the things that you think that you're doing now in the society that you live in. They don't have that worldview as you. They're okay. They live and travel in small groups. They don't need all those material things. It means very little to them in their culture. You're disrespecting Africa and African culture. So with that comes a little ass whooping, a little straightening, a little scholastic straightening. I ain't got to go dig into what all them long hour videos and listen to that rhetoric and none of that foolishness. I don't want no part in that. I'm quiet. I'm in my own lane, minding my business. I might show up in a chat here and there, but I ain't showing what side I'm on. And I'm staying right down the middle of the pipe where I need to be. And I'm looking at all the fallacies being made, all the claims that are being thrown out, and who's saying what, that he said, she said. But you gonna get some of this African straightening. Because this white lady just sit here and told you straight up and down that material culture evolved up out of the continent of Africa and went elsewhere where people would add on and develop into. She said that. Then she told you to respect other people's perspectives, the farmers, the hunter and gatherers, and the people who populate small areas. They all have different worldviews and onsets and expectations in life. Everybody does not have to have the high society technology and the things of that nature. They can understand where they are in their natural world and speak to those things. Whether you like it or not, you don't have agency on how other people's worldview is. So when you minimize Africa or African culture, or our dear brother who sits up there and cuts hair in Baltimore sits there and say, well, we don't deal with that, and says all that rhetoric, you are lost because you don't understand culture. But that ain't our culture. You are a descendant of that, and that material culture that was brought over here during the trans-Saharan slave trade, when our ancestors was kidnapped. Our direct ancestors brought the development of certain things that they learned from the continent here, and it manifested into what we do every day. Although we've converted and adapted and assimilated to certain aspects of culture, of other people's cultural nuances and normals. So I appreciate everybody tuning in today. If you're late, you're gonna have to catch the rewind, man. It was an excellent bill filled with a lot of information and data that actually sets the table for reminding people why you represent Africa. We represent Africa. We represent African culture. We represent diaspora African culture. We represent African American culture. We gonna show you how to get this culture. We gonna get it 10 toes down. And anybody that got a motherfucking problem with Africa, come see the Massey Warrior Clan. We on your heads. And we ain't gonna argue with you about it. We just gonna beat you up the head with this sound scholarship and source it up.
Carter on the beat.